how can you sell experience management to the CFO? Can XLAs really impact revenue? And why is XLA Institute coming to America? We're going to talk about this and so much more on today's episode of Bites and Banter with Doug Rabold, North American XLA Evangelist. Doug, let's get into it.
All right. Looking forward to it, Rocky.
On this episode of Bites and Banter, we're joined by Doug Rabold, the North American and XLA Evangelist for XLA Institute. How you doing today, Doug?
I'm doing great, Rocky.
I'm so excited to talk to you. You've been a known commodity, if you will, within the HDI community. You've offered a lot of just insight throughout your years involved and engaged in the ITSM community. I would love to start by you just talking through kind of how did you land in IT? Because your background is really unique. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, my journey has been very interesting. You're right. I don't have an IT background. I started off in sales and sales management in a completely different industry, in financial sales of all things. But what I did in that capacity was I did a lot of solution-based selling. I always looked for, I say people buy things for two reasons. Either they're trying to avoid some pain that they're experiencing today, or they're trying to approach some pleasure that they want to experience tomorrow. And so I always approach sales from that perspective. How do I get to that goal that they have, that objective, and help them achieve that? 42 years old, I got entirely sick and tired of the sales rat race and decided to chuck it. I gave up a six-figure salary 25 years ago, which was a crazy thing to do. Not many people gave up six figures 25 years ago. But I did that and started over from the bottom. I started off as a level one analyst on an IT service desk, working nights, earned $32,000 the first year. So that's always fun, taking a 60 plus $1,000 hit in the income. But it was all with an objective in mind, and that was that I would grow from, sort of learn the business from the inside out, learn IT from the inside out, because I had no formal training in technology, and I had no certifications when I embarked on that career change. So I had to learn it from the school of hard knocks, if you will. And I did. Trust me, I went through plenty of hard knocks the first couple of years on a service desk. But my approach there was really the same. It was people are calling me for one of two reasons. Either there's some pain that they're experiencing right now, or there's some pleasure that they want to experience tomorrow. Whether it was an incident, that was the pain today, or a service request, which was the pleasure tomorrow. So that was always my approach, and it served me very well because that timing, really, that was about 15 years ago. That timing is when IT service desk went from being the helpless desk of, have you tried turning it off and back on again, to being how do we really fix the underlying issue? How do we dig deeper, and how do we deliver that with empathy and understanding? So that was a huge change in the way that IT help desk ran, and it was fortunate that that was my approach as far as the timing goes. So I progressed very rapidly. Went from being a level one service desk tech to being a director in like 4 years. 5 years, I guess. But the idea being that I understood the business side of things already. And I also understood, how do you build empathy? How do you deliver a positive experience, not just technical support? And so that's really been my journey, if you will, from my past career to my current career. But what happened, and the way that I got really actively engaged in the experience management world is several years ago at an HDI conference at the service management world. At the height of the pandemic, I think it was the first one. It was 2022 when they rebooted SMW. I happened to meet a gentleman named Alan Nance, who many in our community are very familiar with. And Alan and I sat down over probably one too many drinks, frankly. But what was intended to be like a 15-minute conversation wound up being about 3 hours. And we talked through really sort of this evolution of how can we evolve IT service management from the better experience that we're delivering today to an exceptional experience, which is really what the customers demand today. It's not just
Mm,
that they want it, it's that there's a demand for exceptional experience. And that's something that I'm not sure IT service management as a whole has seized upon. As an
mm,
example, ITIL 4 came out with the whole co-creation of value methodology, and that whole aspect of things. But I'm not entirely positive that it went far enough. And so when Alan and I started talking through the whole process of XLAs, experience level agreements, and how they help to evolve that relationship and the delivery of service, it truly resonated with me. And so, he and I have stayed in touch over the years, and an opportunity came up, where he called on me and said that maybe we could work together to bring this to market, if you will, in the U.S.
mm. That quite quite the journey and a lot of different moving pieces, and it's funny because 2022 is the first year I got to go to Sport World Live. It's the first year I even realized HTI local chapters was a thing. And I met Alan Nance. I went to his Experience Foundation workshop, and it was kind of a pre-con, and it was like the first day, last day of pre-con. It was 1 day session, right? It wasn't a 3 day session.
Right.
And I'd be curious to hear you, Doug, talk a little bit about, because you talked about empathy, you talked about, right, just the really envisioning a future that you want to exist that doesn't exist yet, right? And providing exceptional experience. How, I know you being an XLA evangelist, which our market so needs people like you who are looking at XLAs and who are literally evangelizing the value they bring. What is experience management? How do XLAs tie into it, right? For the listener who maybe has been in a world in IT support, whether it's internal, MSP, but all they know is SLAs. What's the difference? Why XLAs? How do they build that exceptional experience that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, probably most of the listeners to the show are familiar with SLAs, whether it's on the giving or the receiving side of that equation. Um, Service level agreements, SLAs, are just sort of those standards that we all adhere to. Everybody wants an FCR that's 85% or better, and everybody wants a CSAT that's 92 or better. So we all know what they are. Handle time. There's a lot of times there's SLAs for that. On down the line, there's all these different SLAs. And most of them are very quantitative. They tend to be very driven by how much, how often, how frequently. And so, in essence, a lot of them are just kind of productivity standards, if you will. They're efficiency and productivity measures. But the challenge with most of those productivity and efficiency measures are that they don't necessarily resonate with or correlate to what the end user wants.
Mm,
They don't necessarily give that touchy feely. And I do a little exercise in just about every presentation I do, whether it's on XLAs or not. And that is, I'll ask my audience to raise their hand if they're using CSAT. And most of the hands in our business go up when you ask that question. And then I'll ask them, hey, keep your hands in the air if your CSAT is 80% or better. And pretty much every hand that was up stays up. Then I'll say, okay, 85%, keep it up. Still, most of the hands are up. 90%, a couple start dropping. 92, and by then, maybe half or more of the hands have dropped. And you get to 95, and then you've still got a couple people in there that still have their hands up. And I'll be like, okay, those of you who have your hands up, do you believe that 95 out of 100 of your callers are truly satisfied with your service? And of course, then all the hands drop. So even we don't believe these quote unquote sentiment measures and SLAs that we've established, and that's because we know that they don't correlate. The difference with XLAs is that we're actually focusing in on those few things that are absolutely critical to delivering a positive feeling in the end users. And so it's a matter of finding those key elements, those key aspects, those key drivers to positive, exceptional experience that they're looking for, and finding out the data points that correlate to those and delivering that, as opposed to delivering what we want, we're delivering to the end user what they want, and there's the huge difference. And the sort of the trite and true measure is that SLAs deliver, or they deliver outputs, XLAs deliver outcomes. That's really the axiom, if you will, for what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, I think that output and outcome are so often used interchangeably when they're so different, right? Output is a measurement of, like you said, productivity. Outcome's a measurement of value, right? Of
Yeah.
truly the value that you bring. And uh, I'd be curious, Doug, when you think about, that outcome, is it for those who maybe have never, they're kind of just new to this whole concept of XLAs, right? It's becoming more and more common, but it's still fairly new when you think about the grand scheme of ITIL and SLAs in the market and in our business. For those people who maybe haven't seen them in action, are XLAs something that are stagnant? Or how do you identify, those measurements you're talking about? Like, walk me through like the process to even understand, hey, what should we be measuring? Because these transactional measurements, like you said, aren't necessarily getting to the root of the feeling and the experience that's truly being offered. What are those things we should be looking for as we navigate moving from a service mentality to this experience mentality and implementing XLAs?
Yeah, great question, Rocky. So, I guess I would start by saying if you don't know what they are and you don't have them in place, do not feel alone. There's a reason that I've been asked to be the North American evangelist for XLAs, and that's because Europe is like years ahead of us. This is actually fairly common in continental Europe now, XLAs. And I wouldn't say every company in continental Europe has them, but there's definitely probably a majority of companies that do. But it's only now just starting to cross the pond. So it's not uncommon for North American companies not to know what XLAs are or to have ever seen them. So one, don't worry if you don't know what they are and don't have them in place. We'll get you there. But two, when it comes to what you want to focus on, you touched on a couple of topics, Rocky, and thank you for doing so. They are not permanent. Unlike these SLAs that you probably established 15 years ago or 20 years ago or sometime in the murky depths of time and haven't revisited them except when there was some major incident that forced you to. XLAs, by contrast, are very dynamic. They're not static. In fact, they should be revisited on a very regular basis. And the lifetime of an XLA is typically only 15 months. That's sort of the standard. And that's because experiential objectives change very rapidly. Sort of the prime example I give is if you had established, well, let's go back. So we go back to, say, December of 2019 or January of 2020, and you had these SLAs in place, and they'd been in place for years and years, and everybody expected we'll deliver this because we always do. Well, April of 2020 hits, and guess what? The world has changed, and those SLAs, you're either not meeting them anymore because you can't, because there's nobody boots on ground to assist, or you're getting what they call the waiver. You're getting an exception. It will waive that SLA. Well, that's great, but to the end user, is it really? So all we're doing is we're making our stats look better by getting exceptions and getting waivers of SLAs. By contrast, if you had XLAs in place, you just change them. Hey, the ones we established in December of 2019 are no longer valid. What is valid now? Well, what's valid in April of 2020 is how do I get a laptop into somebody's hands? How do I provide them support when there's nobody there to help them? Those are the kind of XLAs that you would develop. And then by the time we get to, say April of 2021, well, now everybody's got it figured out. Everybody's cooking along. Now let's focus in on how do I do application support remotely and things like that. So you start changing, iterating on what the focus is. And that focus is based on, again, what's important to the end user. How do I deliver what they need and demand right now? And will for the next 6 to 15 months. But let's not go further than that. And also, let's not try to boil the ocean and fix everything that they want in the next 6 to 15 months. Let's focus in on the 3 to 5 things that are most important to them right now.
I'm thinking about just putting my I'm not an executive, but I'm thinking about if I were an executive, putting that hat on and thinking about overall business goals, right? And every organization is going to be a little different in terms of what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, but every CFO has the same goal, right? They need to drive revenue. They need to increase their profit, improve their margins. How, if you're sitting at the table with a CFO or someone in that C-suite type level who's got to make the decisions to support this, what are you telling them about the impact of their business? Because yes, end user experience matters, but maybe for them, they don't understand the difference between CSAT, right? Quality scores at the service desk and true experience. So how do you navigate them and walk them from point A to point B to get them to understand the true impact it could have on their business?
So you didn't throw me a layup with that one, Rocky. That's for sure. Because the CFO is the hardest nut to crack in every organization. And it's easy to have that dialogue and try to try to paint the pretty picture of saying, hey, you correlate positive experience, and those companies that do it, it's no secret here that I'm a big Disney fan, and they're renowned for their customer experience, guest experience in their case, that those companies that focus in on those things are the ones that tend to be very successful. But that's great, but CFOs are always thinking bottom lines. They're always thinking numeric, right? And so what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to, in the case of a CFO, not just talk the talk, but you need to be able to walk the walk with them. And that is, you need to be able to show them the positive bottom line or top line. You can sell them top line, but that's usually a little bit harder sell, because then they want to go down the Gen AI route and oh, I can just replace people. I can rip people out of the equation and save money that way. But you can start to show the bottom line impact, and you need to be prepared to have that conversation of showing what the bottom line impact of delivering positive experience is. And usually you can do that by showing improved retention rates, by showing improved renewal rates, by showing positive lifetime value. When you begin to get repeat customers, when you begin to get increased referrals, those are the kind of things that resonate with a CFO, and you need to be able to show them that, on a chart that has numbers affixed to it. You can't just have that esoteric conversation there.
And it kind of brings me back to just the reality that IT for so long has been in its little bubble, right, of technology and technology support. But we're moving, even the ITSM space is changing, right? Moving to an ESM space where enterprise service management is now becoming the new expectation and norm. And it just brings me back to just the reality of how important it is for us as IT practitioners to understand the business outcome that we're trying to achieve, right? And part of that is the persona, and what that persona is doing across the organization. And different organizations is going to look different to help achieve those goals. So walk me through, Doug, kind of how does this whole idea of persona and it tied to XLAs, like how can you marry those? Like how can you look at different personas in the business, different projects that they're working on, to really ask the question, what can we measure in terms of the experience these folks are having?
Yeah, and that's a great intro, if you will, to sort of a whole other aspect to this, Rocky, and that is part of that prioritization effort that you need to go through in developing XLAs and implementing XLAs is where is it going to make the biggest difference? And every quote unquote tower, if you will, every line of business, every business unit has their own little quirks and own little issues and own little things that they want fixed. And I'll throw it out there because we just got done with the CFO conversation. The C-suite is the ones who always want those special snowflake treatments, right? But is that where you're going to get the most bang for the buck? Yeah, you might get the most goodwill out of it. But from the bottom line perspective, going back to that CFO, and this is where you can use the CFO to your advantage, if you will. It's not the objective of the initial round of XLAs is not to improve the executive desktop support function. It's probably something that's going to impact bottom line margin or bottom line productivity. And I hesitate to use productivity, but that's going to be a good business outcome. That's going to deliver positive business value. And so, as an example, if boot speeds are outrageously slow across the entire business unit, let's say on a production floor, you've got slow boot speeds on all the terminals. Well, guess what? You're costing the company massive amounts of money. Sort of the law of large numbers. It's, everybody on the production floor slows down for 2 minutes every day, or 3 times a day for each shift. So you need to identify what are those key drivers that are going to deliver greatest business value first. And that's how you win over executives. And winning over the executives is going to be the hard part. In fact, I just worked with Mark Smalley. He actually wrote a book, and I was a peer reviewer for it. And it's all about selling XLAs to the C-suite. And one of the things I told him is, right now, what I'm seeing in the U.S., which is very different from the experience right now in continental Europe, is we're having to kind of push it up as opposed to, I'm sorry, over there they're having to push it up. Here we're having to actually get it driven down from above. What I'm seeing in the U.S. And the Western Hemisphere more often than not is it's executives who are driving the adoption of the XLA methodology as opposed to the other way around. So that's sort of an interesting quirk that we're seeing a little bit of a difference in how it's being done in the U.S.
Now, that makes sense, and I think it's just interesting to talk about just the different parts of the business, right? Because some organizations, your product development team is going to be critical to that bottom line to sell the CFO on their experience improvements and how that matters. And some other organizations, it might be logistics, right? And so there's all these different moving pieces of the business. So when you're navigating, right, you said 15 months is the life cycle, the normal life cycle in XLA. When you're navigating how to determine what the next XLA is or how we're doing against an XLA measurement, how do you do that in an effective way? Obviously, you can't do it in a vacuum. So what does that look like to make sure you're getting the most value out of what you're actually measuring for that business outcome?
Yeah, so the governance piece is so critical when it comes to XLA and a successful implementation. One, we are so accustomed in our world and in our service management and SLA driven world to everything being in a bubble. What's within my span of control? So, as an example, the service desk has their own SLAs, and then, remote desk side has theirs, and field services has theirs, and desk side support has theirs, and apps and infra, and on down the line. You can kind of go. Each silo has their SLAs, which is great because they control what they're accountable for. Where XLA becomes so very different is you have to have this experience management office governance in place, which is very cross-functional, and everybody has to, in essence, sort of co-own the delivery and the delivery excellence of each given XLA. So just because Service Desk didn't resolve it doesn't mean that when they kick it to RDS and then RDS pokes around and figures out that they can't fix it, so they send it to field services, that doesn't mean that each of them, because they met their individual SLAs, have delivered a positive experience. And so this is where that XLA governance structure has to come into place. It has to be cross-functional, and everybody has to take a bite of the pie. I'll tell you that there was a very interesting conversation I had at the QATC conference earlier this year. And QATC, for those who aren't familiar, is sort of an offshoot of ICMI, which is very customer service driven. It's more in the frontline customer support as opposed to end user support. And they asked me to speak on the topic of XLAs, and I told them, I don't think your audience is ready for this. And they told me, no, we want you to speak on this topic. And there was a young man, I got about halfway through my presentation, a young man raised his hand. And I always encourage people to interrupt me during a presentation because I'd rather it be a dialogue. And he says, we're doing these. We just didn't know there was a vocabulary for it. And I said, explain that to me. How are you doing these? What's your business? And he says, well, I work for a company that distributes. They do distribution of people's compensation from government, their government programs. And I said, how are you doing XLAs? He said, well, what we did is we found that there are so many places where our payees don't get their pay deposited in their account on time. There's so many opportunities for gaps that what we did is we actually developed end-to-end processes that allow it to flow smoothly. We have and everybody owns a piece of it. And we actually get compensated based on payees getting the money in their account when they need it, when they expect it. He says, it doesn't matter if it's their bank who dropped the ball. From an end user or from a customer perspective, that payee just knows that they don't have their money when they want it. So we're on the hook for their bank. And I'm like, yeah, you're doing XLAs because the end to end from the time that they submit their paperwork until the time that they get the money in their account, you're owning it. Everybody owns it. And it amazes me that, we sometimes think that IT service desks and call and contact centers are so very different. And what I'm seeing is there's this convergence that's going on. Like I said, the timing of my career change into IT service desk coincided with when we got away from the have you tried turning it off and back on again mentality. And what I'm seeing now too is in the call and contact center space, there's an expectation that they are much more technically driven, that they have much higher technical skills than they've had to have in the past. They don't just pass everything off right away. So it's funny, there's this convergence going on, and I'm an advocate for, I think there's a place for XLAs in call and contact centers too, not just in IT and IT service management shops.
Mm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the contact center, business, and some of it's internal, some of it's outsourced. It doesn't matter. It's similar to IT. There's still a customer, an end user, if you will. I know Alan Nance, you talked about your beers with him. He hates that term, end user. But you have that human on the other end of the interaction that has a desired experience you're trying to provide, right? I think if you think about it, Doug, I don't think we're there yet, but almost every industry has a component of that, right? That you could figure out, how do we measure this? And I think that's the uniqueness with XLAs is, like you said, it's not a standard, let's put this number on a metric, we're going to measure it forever. It's going to change based on the business, based on the outcome you're trying to achieve, based on who's trying to achieve that, based on the technology you use that you're trying to use to achieve that, based on the technology changes, right? And all of these different things in your unique business. And it brings me to the question, what does an XLA measurement look like, right? And I know there's indicators that kind of roll up into an overall score. Walk me through just the framework, because we know what SLAs look like. My grade of service is 85% in 30 seconds. My MTTR is less than 1.2. We know that, right, in our IT support industry. But what does an XLA measurement actually look like?
Yeah, so prosecution is leading the witness in this one. You guys at Unisys know your stuff, Rocky. So typically what an XLA is going to look like, and remember too that these are somewhat ephemeral. So usually you don't want to invest a whole ton of time into what they look like, but usually what we do is we go through and we identify what the data points are that are going to drive the expected behavior or the objective that we have for that given XLA. And those data points, contrary to kind of going back to what I said about SLA, those data points may span different support areas. In fact, they should probably span different support areas, and they could even go into other quote unquote non-support areas in your ESM analogy. As an example, when you talk about employee onboarding, which is if there's one universal XLA that everybody could use, that's it. Employee onboarding. I don't care how good your onboarding process is, there's some gap somewhere that could be addressed with an onboarding XLA. But that could entail HR data points, which we in IT we never think of data points coming from HR, and we do our best not to ever talk to HR. But that's one of the keys is finding those data points and then monitoring them. And ideally, what you want to do is develop some sort of indexing across those various data points. And usually what it looks like is some kind of speedometer meter with a green zone and a yellow zone and a red zone. But the different thing about XLAs, contrary to our lifelong training in SLAs, according to ITIL, is there's not necessarily bad performance on an XLA. There's we didn't meet our objective, or we did meet our objective, or we're approaching our objective, and that's where those zones come in. But the reality is, that it should almost never. I'll never say never, but it should almost never. It's as close to never as I'll ever say. Be tied to penalties or even incentives. I mean, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to deliver positive experience for the end user, and that's what our objective is with implementation of XLAs. It's not it's not a financial thing for us, and it's not another way to browbeat your IT team. What it is it's a way to project a positive experience for the end user. So yeah, usually what you're going to do, like I said, have a dashboard built that has speedometers to it with various zones, and then obviously you want to monitor, you want to drive the things. You look at the underlying data points, identify, because you're also going to color code those underlying data points. Some of those data points may show green, and yet the whole thing, on the speedometer shows yellow or still red, maybe. And so what that does is it points out to you which are the data points where the gaps are occurring, and then allows you to focus in on that particular gap area.
So the dynamic nature of XLAs, I think this makes me think, like, I'm thinking about this as you describe that. I can see it in my head. Let's say you have a red, parameter you're measuring, but everything's on the top is kind of green, or you have green, everything's kind of like yellow. It's not quite there yet. Does that give you the opportunity to, as the governance is happening and you're looking at the experience that you're measuring, to maybe say, hey, we don't, that really doesn't matter to the overall experience. Maybe we thought it did, maybe it didn't. Like, how does that look like when you're trying to navigate? Are we measuring the right things?
Yep, absolutely, and that's the beauty of XLAs. If the customer's telling us that they're happy, and they genuinely mean it, it's not just VOC data that doesn't align with the sentiment. If the sentiment is genuinely positive, we probably just have some underlying data point that is not relevant to them. We thought it was, and even in the conversations that we workshop, they told us it was, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. And so that's sort of the beauty of this is just because we said we were going to measure that particular data point and it should be included in the indexing, doesn't mean that we were right. And so we can change it. We can, and ideally, if the sentiment is positive enough, we can just park that whole XLA and move on to the next big thing.
I think about the onboarding experience you talked about. It's almost like saying we're measuring, did somebody like the pen they got, right? Like, maybe we think they care about the swag they get. Maybe they don't. You never know, until you measure it, until you figure it out. And I, being that, HDI, we are IT support, and local chapters focuses on the IT practitioner, and I think we are moving more broad as a whole in terms of IT being focused on experience. I'd be remiss, Doug, if I didn't ask you, when it comes to experience management and XLAs, how do you see Gen AI and AI as a whole really impacting the future of the market in XLAs in general?
Yeah, that's a well. Anybody who claims to be an expert on what Gen AI is going to do to our industry in the next 5 years, if they genuinely are an expert, I would love to hear what they have to say. But there's a lot of talking heads right now. Is what and I don't want to be a talking head. Do I think it's going to have an impact? Absolutely. How do I think it's going to impact it? I can tell you the Doug Rabold perspective. I don't know that I will disavow myself of this being an XLA Institute position. What Doug Rabold sees is that um, we're going to have agents who are in essence kind of unicorns going forward, and by that I mean the what I keep hearing right now is upskilling people. And what does that mean? Most of the people who are using that term think of it in technical terms because Gen AI is going to soak up all the easy stuff, all the stuff that agents get repeatedly over and over again. So what's going to be left is the more highly technical stuff. And that's great. We do need to upskill them technically. But the problem with that is if you stop and think about what the challenges are, where people get extremely emotional is in those higher complexity issues. And so the agent is going to have to not only be able to solve that higher complexity technical issue, but they're also going to have to handhold the end user who is experiencing the emotional downfall of their ability to do their work. So what I see evolving over the next several years when it comes to Gen AI is we need unicorn agents. We need people who
Mm.
have both the soft skills and the technical skills. And I hate the term soft skills. Let's say human skills. They
Mm.
have the human skills and the technical skills to be able to handhold somebody through a extremely complex issue that frontline support, which is now being driven by generative AI, couldn't solve for them.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Organizations who want to thrive in their IT support and their organization support, really, right, and the support of the associates and the business outcomes, have to be thinking about how do we enable our teams, our support teams, and this could be IT support, this could be any support role, contact center, right, customer interactions. How do we enable them better to fix complex issues by also really humanizing that interaction? Because historically, IT are not the most cushy people, right? If you like tinkering, you like working with computers, you're usually not naturally, right, wrong, or indifferent, um, the most heavy when it comes to that human connection skills. And I think being remote, it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic shapes that for our industry too, right? Because so many workers are either hybrid or remote. How do you get that same skill set when you're not having as much human interaction in person? I don't know the answer to the question. I'm not sure, but it's one that I think, for me comes to mind. Like, how do we really intentionally do that? And maybe XLAs can measure that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be it's going to be an interesting evolution the next several years, and I think some of the trepidation around like that rhetorical question you just asked, and I'm assuming that was rhetorical.
Yeah.
I hope you're not looking for the answer from me.
No.
No, but I think some of the trepidation around that is what's leading to companies that 2 years ago were saying, "Hey, remote forever," to "Hey, get back in the office." And I think it's because they don't know the answers to what is very much a rhetorical question. There are some people who are wired to work remotely. There are others who are wired to better work within an office. And to me, that's why even hybrid isn't the answer. What the answer is, give people choices. If somebody is productive and efficient and effective working from home, let them work from home. And if somebody is much more productive and efficient and effective working within the office, let them work from the office. But don't force round pegs into square holes and vice versa. To me, that's the way you solve problems like that is be creative. I feel like we've and without getting political, I feel like our society has become very polarized, and it's always A or B. It's very binary the way that our society has evolved recently, and it doesn't have to be A or B. There's other
Mhm.
creative solutions that we can look at.
Yeah, and I think XLAs can play a huge part for organizations in understanding, right, if they are trying to go hybrid, they think that's the best way forward for whatever reason. Measuring that experience, are they truly providing their employees the experience they anticipate, right? Like, there's just such a resonating theme of that experience and measuring that and the importance of that. Because think about it, if you are measuring the experience of employees who are returning to work and who maybe have spent the last 2 3 years remotely, or they're returning to work in a hybrid environment, how many different factors are there as an organization that you need to take into account, and are you measuring those?
Yeah. And to your point too, are we are we making assumptions, or are we gathering data and then making decisions based on facts? And I think, and you sort of brought up something that touches on another axiom that I use frequently in just about every presentation. That is, people got into IT because they like digits and widgets more than they like people. Um, to me, that's just the reality. And I think what we need to do is we need to get better about engaging with people and finding finding what drives them. There's a reason shadow IT occurred after the rise of cloud computing, and that's because they didn't need to come to us anymore. They didn't come to they no longer needed to come to us so that we could tell them what they could have, as opposed to them saying, this is what I need, give it to me. And that's what shadow IT was. That was the rebellion saying, I'm going to go get what I need, not what you're telling me I can have. And so I think now it's incumbent on us, through methodologies like developing XLAs, to go out and gather that data and deliver what they demand, not what we tell them they can have.
So I want you to talk a little bit about XLA Institute, right? This is something that fully launched, in 20, we're going to be in 2025 when this launches. In 2024, we saw the launch in the EU. What is XLA Institute, Doug? What are you going to be doing for XLA Institute? How can people engage with XLA Institute? How are they going to be, evangelizing and bringing XLAs to bear in the overall industry, whatever industry you're in? Like, what part are they going to be playing or trying to play in this whole idea of experience management?
Yeah, so XLA Institute it's very exciting, and obviously, I've embraced the whole idea. So XLA Institute is based in Amsterdam. I actually got the opportunity. It was completely unexpected. Sort of, I was connecting for a flight through Amsterdam to go to Helsinki earlier this year, and I was asked, hey, we're having day one of our XLA Institute event in Amsterdam. Would you take a later flight and come run a workshop for us? And I was like, okay, sure. What the heck? So, no sleep. I show up, and in my flight wear, which is a little more casual than what I'm dressed even today. But I show up, I run a workshop, and really I was just so excited, and I got to meet folks that have been in this business. Like I said, I first heard about XLA from Alan 2 years ago. And I got to talking to people who are much younger than either you or I, Rocky, and they wrote their first XLAs, created their first XLAs like 6 years ago. And I'm like, oh my God, we're so far behind in the US. Um, so that was the initial XLA Institute kickoff or launch in Amsterdam. And then you're right, in the UK, they had the launch in the fall of this year. And now in January, late January, we're going to do the USA launch. And what that's going to look like, we're going to do a half-day online event, a virtual event. And then from there, we're actually going to look at doing some road shows and having some events in different regions throughout the country. We're also going to be offering training and certification for those who don't know much about XLA. We'll have opportunities to get trained and certified in the creation of XLAs. And then even beyond that, we're going to look at doing things like developing, in essence, sort of a corporate box, if you will, where as an organization, whether that's an MSP or a corporate organization, where you get certain number of memberships to that would allow you access to heavier content and also research, things like that, case studies, and it's really it's really sort of re-energized me in the whole service management space, if you will. Looking at how do we deliver it from an experience perspective as opposed to just sort of the typical ITIL approach. And as far as what XLA Institute does, obviously content creation and availability is one of the key aspects. But the other thing that we're very focused in on, and this is something that, again, without getting ITIL political, something that I think ITIL lost when the framework went corporate, if you will. This is going to be practitioner owned. So the whole methodology between XLA creation, between experience management, the standards and what have you. We're going through the ISO standardization process right now, getting it ISO approved. So all of that is going to be done through the practitioner community as opposed to being delivered by a publishing house.
Exciting stuff. And actually, when this episode launches, you will have had that virtual session most likely the day before. So exciting times to be
Great.
in the ITSM space, experience space. And Doug, is there anything else you want to just for the audience to know about XLAs, about XLA Institute, about what you're doing, about experience management, the value it brings, before we ask our final send-off question?
Yeah, so the call to action would be learn about XLAs. If you work for an organization that values experience, learn about them. Feel free to reach out to me. I have a heavy presence on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Say, hey, Doug, I want to know more. Obviously, XLA Institute has a website. I would encourage you to go there. There is some free content. There's also member-driven content that, like I said, goes a little bit deeper, allows research, case studies, things like that. But learn about this because it's coming, folks. We are in you used the term earlier, Rocky. We're transitioning from a service economy to an experience economy, and Alan uses that terminology very frequently. And as part of that experience economy, people are going to spend where they perceive the experience value. So it's coming. So please learn about it, educate yourself. Like I said, feel free to reach out to me and also look at the XLA Institute website.
And we'll make sure all the links are in the description of all the episodes wherever people are listening or watching this episode of Bites and Banter. And before we close out, Doug, I ask every guest send off question, and I'm going to ask you the same. And I'm really intrigued to hear what your answer is. If you could hit rewind, and you can pick the time in your life, maybe it's when you're in sales, maybe it's as you transition to IT, maybe it's before then. What is one piece of advice or words of wisdom you would give younger Doug Rabold?
So, the piece of advice I would give my younger self, and I've kind of done it, but I didn't do it the way that I would do it now. The advice I would give myself would be pursue your dreams and do it without hesitation. And that second clause is the part that I've been challenged by. I stayed in my sales career for far too long. I was already burnt out at age 42. And that's why I was more than willing to give up 2/3 of my income to make that change. So I was hesitant in actually pulling the trigger and making that move. In a sense, I've kind of done that same thing in some other aspects of my life. And so where my interests are, I've pursued them, but I've sometimes delayed. And so if anybody's familiar with Roman history, one of the generals was known as cunctator, which in Latin means the delayer. So I would challenge myself to not be a cunctator and actually pursue my dreams more rapidly than what I have. I would love to be doing this 15 years ago, like when I had a little bit more energy than I do today.
Yeah. So if you're listening, take that advice. The Doug Rabold, chase your dreams without hesitation. And thanks, Doug, for your time. I appreciate it. Some fantastic wisdom on XLA's experience matters. Experience management is going to impact the culture of organizations for the foreseeable, indefinite future. And we will catch you on the next episode of Bites and Banter.